Bolt, and this is the Bolt Report. Europe has imported a war into its own streets, a war between Islam and the West that can no longer now be disguised, avoided. On Friday, the 13th, 8 Islamist terrorists in Paris killed more than 120 people in coordinated attacks at least 6 different locations, including restaurants and a football stadium, where a bomb went off as France played Germany while the French president watched. The worst slaughter occurred at a theatre where more than 80 people were killed. Survivors fled, some dragging their injured friends.
I've seen two terrorists, from my point of view, with AK-47 Kalashnikovs entering the concert room and firing randomly to the crowd. It lasted for 10 minutes, 10 horrific minutes, where everybody was on the floor covering their head, and we heard so many gunshots.
More than 300 people are in hospital. Most of the 8 attackers blew themselves up. All died. This terrible mass murder comes 11 months after other Islamist terrorists in Paris killed 17 people at the Charlie Hebdo magazine and at a Jewish supermarket. The Charlie Hebdo journalists were killed for insulting Islam. The Jewish shoppers were killed for being Jews. Now the Islamic State says it carried out Friday's massacre because Paris is a capital of crusaders and of prostitution and vice. It carries the cross, and more attacks will come, says the Islamic State, if France keeps attacking it in Syria and Iraq. But while the excuses for the terrorism changes, the targets do not. They are Westerners and others deemed not Muslim enough. The time for evasion is over. A small but significant minority of Muslims are at war with the West. Many are inspired by a terrorist nation that the West has allowed to form in Syria and Iraq. They quote the Quran to justify their terrorism. Many other Muslims either support or do not resist them. Now, the context of these Paris attacks suggests this threat, this war on Western streets, can only get worse. This year alone, more than 1 million illegal immigrants have flooded into Europe, overwhelmingly Muslim and mostly young men. Many will fit into Europe. Some, undoubtedly, will not. This threat to Europe is extreme. In fact, one of the Paris terrorists had a Syrian passport, which belonged to a man who entered Greece as a refugee last month. Another terrorist had an Egyptian passport, but 3 are believed to have come from Belgium, and another was French-born. In Australia too, the threat grows. ASIO is trying to monitor some 475 separate terrorist threats. More than 150 Australians have fought for the Islamic State, and 3 supporters have killed Australians in attacks in Sydney or stabbed police in Melbourne. How must the West deal with this? Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott last month told Europe, 1, stop the boats, secure the borders. But new Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, just hours before the Paris attacks, met the German Chancellor and gave what journalists with him reported as a slapdown to Abbott, saying he wasn't going to lecture Germany about stopping boats since it wasn't so easy for Europe as it was for us.
Each country faces very different circumstances, not least of which are geographic.
We've also seen the Turnbull government back off from calling on Islamic leaders to reform Islam. But surely that is now urgent. Yet Turnbull, in his response yesterday, did not even mention Islam. Enough with the invasions. Enough, too, with this delusion that if we were only nicer, the jihadists would stop. This is a war. It is driven by a lethal ideology, a version of Islam that is spread or followed by people too free to enter the West. And if we don't defeat this ideology and the Islamic State, more of us will die.